two Benicia Jane Does, identified as Tomye Smith and Dolores Wolf. This story begins officially on March 17, 1983, near Ryder Island, near Benicia, California. Or at least that is the beginning of the case that I plan presenting. However, it got a little more complicated as I began to investigate. We know that a passerby would in 1983 find a skull, but that was not the first time that remains were found in this area. And when the prior remains were found, there was no skull. As a result, the assumption was made they had finally found the skull that they had been searching for since September 17, 1979. But of course, it's a logical assumption and DNA wasn't available. They would eventually bury the remains together as one Jane Doe. As time went by, a sample of DNA was submitted to CODIS, where a man would eventually submit his own DNA in hopes of finding out what happened to his mother, a mother who disappeared in August of 1979. As I've mentioned in other episodes, it's really important if someone's missing a loved one that they contact NamUs and submit a sample. It's confusing with all the acronyms, but it actually goes from NamUs, which is tied into CODIS. But unfortunately, in these cases, you'll see that DNA is taken, but it's a different kind of DNA. The kind they do for this is easier to acquire and more cost-effective. But genetic genealogy searches can't be done with this specific type of DNA. It's basically a one-on-one type of matching. In October of 2020 was when a child began searching for his mom. They would end up doing DNA and realize they had two different people buried in one grave. While no one knows where the skull of Dolores Wolf is, it was her torso and legs that were eventually buried in the grave first, leading of course to a possible final chapter in a family struggle that had stretched over 4 decades. So while I planned on covering the Jane Doe with the skull when I started this, I'm going to actually cover that one second. So this brings us to 2 different identifications. The first remains belong to Dolores Wolf, who in 1979 was the mother of 4 children. She was 45 and her youngest son is the one whose DNA would eventually give her name back. He was just 12 when she disappeared. There had been a huge gathering in July of 1979 for Dolores' aunt and uncle's 50th wedding anniversary. Dolores hailed from a large family who had immigrated to the U.S. from Portugal. She grew up in a home here that spoke Portuguese as her first language. Her family was really tight-knit, and they took it as a group effort to begin learning English together. So big family get-togethers were pretty common, but they had no idea this was the last time that they would see Dolores. At the party, Dolores was goofing around and having fun, and they would remember that she was pretending to be an opera singer, kidding around in the bathroom singing into a brush. Her 2 eldest kids were adults and they were living on their own, but there were still 2 kids living in the Wolf home with Dolores and her husband Carl. The kids would remember that they were trying to deal with the increasingly erratic behavior of Carl. Carl had been drinking a lot and he threatened a lot of people, and especially Dolores. It got so bad that one of her brothers and his wife picked Dolores up, taking her to their home to try to keep her safe. It was on that day Dolores made her brother Matt and his wife Janet make a promise. The promise she asked for was that if Carl were to take her life, as he'd threatened to do, would make sure the 2 boys were still at a home and were taken care of and okay. She was so fearful for her remaining children. Her cousin's wife, Janet, would make that promise, never thinking that it was as serious as it was or that it would actually come to fruition. She said to her, of course, but that's not going to happen. And this was the last time they would ever see Dolores again. At this time, because of Carl's behavior, Dolores found herself struggling a lot with what to do about her marriage. It didn't help that she was Catholic and she didn't feel that she could divorce Carl. But she'd been trying and trying to make it work, and it just wasn't. In recent years, Carl was having a lot of financial difficulties and he had become very angry. He wasn't the man that she had married. The 2 actually did begin marriage counseling, and they had actually gone to see the counselor earlier in the day that Dolores disappeared. Later that night was the anniversary party, and Dolores was dancing in a blue dress with a white flower in her hair. Her family would say she was having a good time, and the last time anyone could remember seeing her, she was gathering up some uneaten food. One of her adult children, Anna Marie, would call her mom a few days later. Carl answered the phone and he would tell her that Dolores ran away during the night, right after the party. Something Anna Marie had a lot of trouble believing, especially when she realized her mom's purse, keys, jewelry, and all of her clothing were still in the house. Not to mention, Dolores was a really great mom who loved her kids more than anything. Anna Marie would go along with a cousin to the police station as soon as the 72 hours had officially passed. Anna bravely told the police that she was sure her father had done something to her mother. On the night that their mom disappeared, the youngest brother, Paul, whose DNA would eventually return his mom's name, he had spent the night at his cousin David's house for David's 13th birthday. The second to the youngest brother, who was 17, was off at basketball camp, so he wasn't home either. Dolores and Carl were home alone that night. The next day, Carl gathered the two boys together and told them that their mother had left and was never coming back. And then within a couple of days, Carl was seen hauling all of Dorothy's belongings out of the house, telling the kids they would just have to move on. It was this moment that would convince the kids that their father had hurt their mother. Carl wasn't just abusive to his wife, he was abusive to the kids also. In fact, he had once hit one of his kids so hard that he had ruptured that child's eardrum, and that child needed surgery to repair it. So the two youngest boys, still living with Carl, were 12 and 17, and they wanted no part of it. They were terrified of their father. They would eventually flee to their uncle's house, saying they wanted to live there and not with their father ever again. The police did show up at the family home to question Carl, and they would note there were no signs of blood, and both Carl and Dolores' cars were on the property at that time. Although it was incredibly suspicious that she left all of her belongings behind, including her purse. They searched the cars outside and would note there was a blood-stained blanket and a single earring in the trunk of Carl's car. So while they had a pretty good idea what happened to Dolores, they couldn't prove it. And back then, you didn't see cases without remains. That was the one thing they would need to prove that he'd taken his wife's life. The police would say the inside of the trunk lid had markings that they believed Dolores put there, saying that, unfortunately, it was greasy in that area and they couldn't get any distinguishable prints. They would say they were pretty sure that at one point, someone had been alive inside of that trunk, and that they were trying to get the trunk open. The family spent the next few years searching for her remains. The children and other relatives would take it upon themselves to make life as hard for Carl as they could. They had hoped that this treatment would finally get him to confess. Carl found himself driving around town with a bumper sticker on the back of his car that said, "I M-worded my wife." It's not clear who placed that sticker there, but it was clear that Carl had no idea it was on his car. And because everyone in the whole surrounding area was so angry with him, no one even told him that was on the back of his car. Different people would begin writing accusations on his house in animal blood. Wooden signs were erected in town that said "This way to the murder house." Because Carl was a prominent insurance executive and board member of the Woodland Chamber of Commerce, these accusations didn't go unnoticed, and it impacted all of Carl's existence from here on out. His family was pretty clear they were not letting go until they got answers. Carl, for his part, would just insist he's innocent. But it's noted they asked Carl to take a polygraph, and this was something that he refused to do. In 1981, it was decided to try to trick Carl into admitting what was done to Dolores. A member of her family would call him from a payphone, claiming to be a sheriff's deputy, and they would tell him that Dolores' remains had been found. It didn't work, though. It just made Carl angry. They would decide again to try the same ploy a little bit later. They had police hiding in unmarked cars and even an airplane sitting on standby. A deputy DA called, claiming to be a newspaper reporter, saying that her remains were found. And Carl did leave, but he didn't lead them to Dolores. Instead, he ran into town to buy a newspaper to see if it was true. He returned home, and that was it. Her family, though, for their part, never gave up on Dolores, and for a long time, they would eventually go in groups of 5 or 6, taking turns with shovels, digging in hopes to find Dolores. All her family wanted was to bring her back home, so they kept trying to find where she'd been buried, looking in local canals and wooded areas, and they even tore up Carl's septic tank to see if she was inside. Dolores' brother Matt, who went by the nickname Slick, and his wife Janet were so angry at the events that they plotted ways to get back at Carl. But the thing that held them back was that there were 2 kids left to raise, kids that wanted nothing to do with their father. and considering Paul was only 12, he had the most to lose. So instead of payback, they chose to give those 2 kids as much love as they could and a solid home to live in. Paul was clear that Slick was the father figure that he'd craved all along. Slick set Paul on his path to coaching for the Washington State football team, just like Slick did. He would say, "He treated me better than my father ever did, and it's not even close." Slick and Janet officially adopted Paul and his brother Tom, giving them the best life that they could without the mom that they loved so much. The cousins they loved became their brothers, and they did all they could to help heal the boys from a loss that they couldn't escape. Carl would insist it was he, not Dolores, who was the victim in all of this, eventually filing a $200 million harassment lawsuit, blaming them for the damage to his property, as well as the calls he was receiving threatening him or trying to trick him into confessing. This lawsuit itself, however, was dismissed. Paul would recount that as all this happened, for a long time, he thought his mom was coming back. He said it took him a long time to accept what adults around him understood the truth to be pretty quickly. The family itself would then eventually file a wrongful death suit in February of 1982 on behalf of Paul, who was then 14. By then, the other kids were 18 and they weren't eligible to do so. They didn't ever expect they would actually win, but they'd hoped that it would place pressure on Carl to finally be honest. Paul would say the entire situation was traumatizing, saying, "Here you are on one side questioning your father about what he's done to your mother." And it would turn out that Paul's family tried really hard to protect him from the suspicions that they had about Carl in the beginning, not wanting to hurt the child by blaming the father without proof. But it all came out during the custody suit and the civil suit, what it was believed Carl had done. By the time Paul was 18, he said that he had a strong fear that his dad would go to his grave never admitting anything. And that admission was so important to him. So he decided he would also try, and it also helped that the Attorney General, for his part, wanted a resolution in this case and an indictment against Carl. So an indictment against Carl was filed on March 8, 1985. Paul would go into the jail wearing a wire. They set it up that while Carl was arrested, Paul would go into jail wearing a wire, in hopes of finally making Carl tell the truth. By this time, Paul was a senior in high school, and he felt this was the last chance. He said he found himself at that station, asking his father questions, trying really hard to get him to confess. What he wanted most was the location of his mother's remains, wanting nothing more than being able to bring her home. But this ruse also failed, so by now Paul was pretty sure he was never going to find the truth. The authorities decided to finally try him without her remains, but then it was legally decided that they'd waited too long to arrest him. They had violated his right to a speedy trial, and with this, he was free. Carl Wulff made a statement to the Sacramento Bee, trying to cement his own victim status, saying, "It's been a trauma. I'll never be the same again." For what it's worth, it appears Carl did love and miss his kids. He was seen alone at some of Paul's games, sitting in the stand. At one point, he called Paul to try to see if they could build a relationship. But Paul would tell his father, no relationship unless you come clean about what happened. So in the end, Carl died alone at age 70 in 2005, completely isolated from an entire family who wanted nothing to do with him. He never faced charges, but he paid in the only way his family could make happen. Paul would then lose the second most important person in his life in 2002 when his wife Tomye was diagnosed with brain cancer in January of 1997. He said because of his history, he had an even harder time letting her go. Her last wish was to encourage him to not give in to the pain, but instead to move on, and he did. He would eventually find love again and have 2 sons himself. As important as it was to Dolores' family to finally know what happened to her, they had pretty much given up, saying it was out of their hands. That one last move that was made was by Paul to donate his DNA in a last-ditch effort, and it changed everything. The detectives would tell him his mother had been a Jane Doe for over 4 decades, but she was finally coming home. What they did not know was that Dolores' remains had actually been found only 2 months after she disappeared. In Benicia, California, which is 56 miles or 90 kilometers away from their home. It must have been just far enough away that nobody guessed. So then, in October of 2020, an officer would finally deliver the news that Dorothy had been found and would be finally coming home after 41 years. This, of course, left the skull that was buried with Dorothy's remains. So then the question is, who was she? I wish I knew as much about Tomye Ross Smith. She wasn't all that far off in age from the woman whose remains she was buried with. But her circumstances were different, as she was estranged from her entire family. We know now that she was found at the beach in the same area, and it doesn't appear she was officially reported missing. They do note, though, that she was last seen in 1980, when she would have been 53. It's unknown for sure when she passed, so she may have been as old as 56. While it says that foul play is not suspected, her lower body hasn't been found, and no COD has been given. The only photo of her is a still of a video where she was singing at an event that was previously shown on TV. Tomye was missing for 43 years, and an unidentified Jane Doe for 40. Had she lived, she would be 96 years old today. Dolores Marie Wulff went unidentified for 41 years. Had she lived, she would be 90 years old today. The Charlotte John Doe, 1988, identified as Oliver Doc Mundy, who went by the name O.D. This one begins in Charlotte, North Carolina on February 9th, 1988. This was at a building on North Tyrone Street near East 6th Street. The building itself was once one of Charlotte, Carolina's nicest hotels. The Dunhill Hotel in Charlotte had originally been the Mayflower Hotel. However, the hotel itself became run down and was losing business until it was fully abandoned in 1981. Then in 1988, it would be reopened with a facelift by a real estate developer. This was eventually rebranded as the Dunhill Hotel, and the hotel itself has a reputation for being haunted, whether you believe in that or not. The remodel was started, and shortly after this, they began working on the elevator. It was here, at the bottom of the elevator shaft, that his remains were found. If they know how long his remains were there, which you often hear me refer to as the postmortem interval, so this would be the time between when he passed and when he was found. But I can't find any mention of how long they believe he'd been there. The framing in many of the reference articles I found suggested that he jumped. The site that speaks about the haunting of this hotel, or the presumed haunting of this hotel, has an article that I've linked to in the description below. According to that site, a mysterious skull was discovered in the basement, which appears, now that we know what we know, to be a pretty inaccurate framing, but it probably adds to the drama of the story that was being told. And according to them, from this building, many people during the Depression jumped off the top of the building. The foreshadowing here was a little bit interesting, as, according to the authorities, there seems to be a belief that he jumped into the elevator shaft. But it's important to mention that it's not uncommon for transients to enter a building that's been abandoned, and accidents happen. It would be 34 years after he was found in June of 2022 that a bone sample was taken to a lab in Texas, and this was from a lab in North Carolina, which is of course the state where our John Doe was found. So for all of that time, his remains were in a storage box waiting for the right time and a new technology. By May of 2023, they had identified him, making the announcement in June of this year. We know now the man that went by the name of O.D. was actually Oliver Doc Mundy, who was born in July of 1923. He eventually enlisted in the service and served in World War II. Unfortunately, O.D. disappeared around 1980, so it's possible he'd been in that elevator shaft around 8 years. If O.D. passed away around the time he went missing, he would have been only 56 years old. On the date he was found, he would have been 64. O.D.'s niece, Becky, would speak out saying, "My life has felt like a roller coaster. I'm between a 2020 episode and a Lifetime movie." She told reporters at WCNC that she was grateful to finally know. She went on to explain she was 11 the last time she saw her uncle. He also fought several key battles in World War II, and he had a hard time processing his memories as he returned from the war. And this would haunt him to the point where he ended up sleeping in the street, she would say. Her father, who was O.D.'s little brother, worried a lot about his brother. Becky went on to say that her uncle was honorable and brave. Her father died never knowing what happened to O.D. She would say this was sad for her, but she was glad to finally know herself. She was quoted as saying, It's been so long, and just to get his remains back with us, my plan is to put my uncle with my dad where he needs to be. That would make my dad so happy. O.D. earned several medals and 2 Bronze Stars. O.D. Mundy was a missing person for 43 years, and an unidentified John Doe for 35. The Salem, Indiana John Doe, identified as Albert Edwin Roadhs, who went by the name Pinky, also known as Bill Lee Hull. This one is a little strange. Bill Lee Hull passed away from natural causes in Salem, Indiana on May 24, 2012. There was nothing suspicious about Bill's life, but when his estate was being processed, there were some questions about his social security number, and this raised some red flags. He lived and was buried under the name Bill Lee Hull, but it turns out that wasn't his real name. But then there's the question of who he was, and the odd fact that he didn't have any fingerprints. He, at some point in his life, had gone to the extra effort of removing them somehow. He had a tattoo on his arm that read Pinky, and that was the only real clue they had to go on. It wasn't until genetic genealogy offered the option of identification that his shocking past was discovered. They now knew the reason why he hid it. Albert Edwin Roadhs had been arrested many times, dating all the way back to his childhood. The mugshot shown here is from 1948, when Albert was just 16. But for Bill, his life of crime was just starting. We know that he was wanted for being part of what's being described as a series of stick-ups in Denver, Colorado, between October and November of 1955. Because I don't want YouTube to suppress this video, I won't use the nickname by the newspapers, but it can be seen on the screen right now. It turns out that he had been the perpetrator of numerous petty crimes as well as felonies. This started out when the authorities in Denver were looking into some cold cases, and it was through that process they began suspecting that Bill Hull, who had been turned into a John Doe, was in fact the perpetrator. It was the tattoo that said Pinky that made them the most suspicious. And for this reason, they decided to pull the DNA and take a look, and it paid off. The crazy thing is, for those in Salem, Indiana, Bill Hull was really well liked. He was just a sweet old man. The only weird thing they found about him was that the fingerprints were burned off. Otherwise, Bill seemed to be living a pretty normal, law-abiding life. But of course, the fact that the fingerprints had been burned off was a huge clue that something wasn't right, and he was probably being looked for in some capacity from some other place. In March of 2023, the Colorado law enforcement officers sought out an organization named Moxie Forensics. And Moxie's been responsible for giving a number of John and Jane Does their name back lately. They eventually extracted his DNA from his femur, and it turned out the investigation was the fastest I'd ever heard of. It took literally 30 minutes on a public genealogy database to find the great niece of a man named Albert Roadhs. They believed their suspicions had been confirmed, but when they reached out to her, she didn't know who Albert Roadhs was. However, because they had suspected this was in fact Pinky Roadhs, his genetic tree pretty much confirmed their suspicion. Pinky was arrested and sentenced to 10 to 15 years at one point. He then got out, and shortly after his release, he was caught breaking into a warehouse along with 2 other people in Longview, Washington on June 4th, 1966. He once again found himself sentenced to 10 to 15 years in September of 1967. It appears that rather than go to jail, he decided to escape, and that he did. While he seemingly disappeared, he had reinvented himself as Bill Lee Hull, and he used that name for 45 years, which was actually about half of his life. Pinky was in a relationship with a woman named Bessie Fields. The two met in a bar in Tucson and stayed living there for 30 years together, although they never married. Unfortunately, Bessie passed away years ago, and they don't know if she knew Bill Hull wasn't really Bill Hull. Her children, who are still alive, have explained that they had no idea. For their part, they don't believe their mother ever knew. This crazy story seems to still be unraveling even, because so much is unknown. It does look that by the time he became Bill Hull, he put his life of crime behind him. We know, of course, that he met Bessie in Tucson, but he eventually later relocated to Salem, Indiana, after about 20 years of living in Arizona. Shortly before his death in December of 2011, when Pinky was 79, he moved into a garage apartment owned by one of Bessie's relatives. He had tried to sign up for Social Security benefits, but that's the problem with using a fake name. They did not believe his ID when it was produced, and he was unable to provide any sort of documents like a birth certificate or his mother's maiden name. And while the Social Security Administration suspected fraud, it's not clear if he was ever investigated. This had to be a risky move. He must have been desperate at the time because I imagine the real Bill Hull was probably already drawing benefits. So Pinky was pretty lucky to have kind relatives of Bessie. It was their home he passed away from natural causes in July of 2012. The police are still hoping people will come forward with information on this case. They're concerned about other unsolved crimes. Pinky Roadhs had gone unidentified for 11 years. Adam, Victim 3, also known as Victim A, identified as Keith Lavell Bibbs. The young man known as Adam, Victim 3 or Victim A, was one of the unknown decedents attributed to a serial named Larry Iser, who was active in the 1980s. He was allegedly picked up in Terre Haute, Indiana, by Iser somewhere around July 10th to 16th in 1983. Iser offered $75 to the young man for specific services that I can't mention here. His remains were eventually found near a man named Johnny Brandenburg Jr., who was identified in 2021. I generally try to say as little about serials as I can because I feel like I give them power if I promote them. So rather than say a lot here, I've provided a couple of links with information about him in the description below. So to keep it short in saying anything about him, I will say he took the lives of a minimum of 21 young men between 1982 and 1984. He picked these men up, offered them money, and would instead take their lives. He would eventually be arrested and sentenced to pay for his crimes with his life. However, before that could even happen, he would pass from an AIDS-related illness. The things that he was known to do to these young men are described as sadistic and cruel. He especially preyed on those who were already at risk for being victimized. It seems that a lot of these young men, in these cases with Iser, Dahmer, Gacy, many of them had been rejected by family and were just existing on the streets. I don't know for sure what Keith Bibbs' life was like, but the sad thing here is there's only one photo of him, at least as I record my audio. I have to admit it makes me hope that he was loved and accepted. Sometimes families are just private and they don't release pictures, and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. Thanks to the DNA, we now know he disappeared 1 year before he was even officially an adult. He was from Chicago, Illinois, and he had been found in Newton County, Indiana, which was about 85 miles or 137 kilometers away from home. Iser's MO was to drug them and take their lives with what I'll just describe as a sharp implement. The photo shown here lists a group of men who lost their lives. If we could take a moment to acknowledge their loss, this column shows their names, which is incredibly sad. These men would now be in their 50s and 60s today if they'd lived. And if you consider this was just a 2-year snapshot in time, that's a lot of people who were just starting out. Thankfully, he was caught before there was even more devastation. Keith Bibbs went unidentified for 39 years. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 56 years old today. The Nogales John Doe, 2002, identified as Donald Hadland, Jr. In 2002, a man was found in a Nogales, Arizona hotel. When he checked in, he had registered under the name of what was described as Edward C. He filled out a form when he registered, saying he was from St. Petersburg, Florida. He would tell the clerk that he was seeing a doctor in Nogales, Mexico. Nogales, Mexico is, just as it sounds, directly across the border from Nogales, Arizona, where he was found. I've only been to Mexico twice, and Nogales was actually the place that we crossed over, just for a day trip. Back then, you didn't have to give any ID at all to cross into Mexico, and then crossing back out, you would need to show your ID to cross back over into the U.S. Of course, nowadays you need a passport. It was eventually determined that the COD was the result of an OD. They went to notify the family and found out, to their surprise, that the man whose identity was used to check into that hotel, that person does exist, but it wasn't actually him. So at this point, they sort of hit a brick wall. It would take 20 years for the authorities to identify the man thanks to his fingerprints. The reason it took so long is that his print was not readable at a time. There have been quite a few identifications lately with a new software that the FBI has been using. It's been an amazing tool. It reads previously hard-to-read prints. As a result, they've made quite a few identifications. I don't know a lot about the program, but the article itself here describes it as next-generation identification. In April of 2017, the print matched an arrest record that took place in Florida for a man named Donald Hadland. So they hit this print in 2017, but they sort of hit a brick wall again. Eventually, however, they were able to keep searching and they located his ex-wife. She would go ahead and view the post-mortem photo, and she would say that it's not him. So then they found themselves back to the drawing board again. At this point, they came to the conclusion that our John Doe was falsely using Donald Hadland Jr.'s identification. So at this point, they had 2 aliases and no idea who he was. They would eventually go to the DNA Doe Project, who eventually teamed up with a genealogical center at Ramapo College in New Jersey. One good thing in this case is that while a person can lie about their name, DNA doesn't lie. It eventually led to 2nd, 3rd, and 4th degree relatives, and the relative of the man they suspected he was, Donald Hadland Jr. So for whatever reason, his ex-wife didn't identify him, but the DNA did. Once they got to this point, they would officially make the match using DNA of his son. It would eventually be discovered that his family had no idea what happened to him or where he went. They explained that to their knowledge, he had been in Tucson, Arizona for a medical procedure, which is a little odd, though somewhat close to what he told the clerk. Tucson, Arizona is in the same general vicinity of Nogales. But it's probably just enough that even checking it out, they wouldn't make a match with the John Doe. So in this case, they were looking for him in the Tucson area when he was actually about an hour away in Nogales all that time. Although obviously in this case it's a bit odd given his target location was Mexico and not the US. It's actually not unusual to cross over into Mexico for dental care or some health care or to get medications. However this came about, in this case it's likely what kept his family from looking in the right place. The picture shown here was taken in 1960 when Donald attended the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. After attending college, he lived in Florida at one point also. Donald Hadland Jr. went unidentified for 20 years. Had he lived, he would be 80 years old today. The Sandy Point, Victoria, Australia John Doe, identified as Christopher Moore. This is one of the oldest mysteries I've covered on this channel. It was Christmas Day 2017 when a snorkeler was diving in a shallow inlet, and this was located in Sandy Point, Victoria in Australia. It was here that the snorkeler found skeletal remains. No personal effects or clothing was found at all in the area. So unfortunately, this didn't leave a lot of clues as to who the person may have been. The coroner would eventually transfer the remains to the Victorian Institute for Forensic Medicine. This was in hopes that DNA might finally give them the clue they need. They would estimate he was a man between 21 and 37, with a height of around 170 centimeters, or 5'7". The strange thing is that when looking at his dental restorations, the forensic odontologist would declare that the dental work was reminiscent of an ancient time, unless of course it was perhaps done in another country. And the DNA would eventually suggest the person lived between the 1600s to 1942, which is a kind of interesting span of time. Originally, they suspected it was the remains of Martin Wiberg, who stole 5,000 gold coins in 1877, having escaped in a boat that they believed sunk around that same year. Though we know now it was not the elusive thief that they had found, but rather a World War I veteran named Christopher Luke Moore, who was a farmer who had drowned in Waratah Bay in 1928. They had actually found a mandible in the shallow inlet shortly after Christopher disappeared, leading to an inquest in 1929 that led to Christopher's father receiving word that his son had been found. And no one expected any further remains to turn up, and of course they didn't for 95 years. It was his grandniece who donated her DNA that confirmed once and for all that Christopher's remains had finally been found. Christopher was born 124 years ago and was just 29 when he passed away. May he rest in peace. The Redondo Jane Doe, identified as Katherine Parker Johnson. On August 29, 2001, a construction crew was beginning to build a home on the 1600 block of Walcott Street in Redondo Beach, California. Some plumbers were digging in the back area of a property, and they would find a garbage bag buried in the backyard of that residence. Inside the bag were the remains of a woman from the neck down. Upon examination, they would estimate her to be around 20 to 40, but unfortunately, it was only these remains that were found. And of course, because there's no skull, there was no way to do any sort of recreation. This was likely done to keep her from being identified, and it worked. At one point, the case was reopened, and the police would actually pull 40 years' worth of missing person reports, looking for anybody that fit her description. But the task, of course, without the skull, was a pretty huge undertaking, and while they did the best that they could, they still couldn't identify her. All in all, they would say they compared her to 47 different cases. Then in 2019, they approached the DNA Doe Project, and it was this project that would end up crowdfunding this case. Of course, it always depends on who is in the public databases when they go to look. They were able to eventually get some hits that were pretty close, believing them to be perhaps a first cousin. But unfortunately, that person ended up being adopted and did not know who her biological parents were. As time would go by, they would get more hits that were closer, but they were still also about at the first cousin level, and it would turn out they were scattered all throughout the United States. So they began approaching them, eventually leading them to an 84-year-old aunt in New Jersey. They were really lucky that this aunt happened to do a lot of genealogy. Detectives would ask the aunt if they knew anyone who disappeared in the late 70s or early 80s, and they got their best lead yet. She said that her half-niece had gone to California but was never heard from again. They would eventually believe that they had finally found Katherine Parker Johnson. This would lead to Katherine's sister and Katherine's daughter, Rebecca. And from there, they would approach Katherine's son, Tony. Both of these kids had no idea what happened to their mom. He would tell investigators that he believed that if his mom had still been living, she would have come back at some point, so he'd long suspected that she'd passed away. They were able to speak to Katherine's husband, Van Johnson, who for his part waited years for his wife to return. He would say that over time he began to believe she just left her old life behind. He'd hoped that she would come back, but she never did, and eventually he had to move on, filing for divorce. He did this in part to make sure that he was able to keep custody of his children, wanting more than anything to make sure that they had a loving and stable home. We know now that Tony was 1 year old when his 21-year-old mother disappeared. She left her home in Memphis, Tennessee, heading to Southern California, leaving her son behind as well as her older daughter, Rebecca. For the next 4 years, Katherine would sort of float in and out of her children's lives. They would explain this was a really difficult time for them. They wanted their mother with them, and they would beg her to stay, but eventually she would go back to living a somewhat transient lifestyle. But she loved her kids, and she sent them letters and made calls. But for their part, they missed her, and they still just wanted her back home. But no matter what, she did stay in contact. She would return one final time on May 13, 1981, when she was 24. Her ex-husband and the kids remember this clearly because it was one day before Rebecca, Katherine's oldest child, was to turn 8. It was the last time Rebecca and her now 5-year-old brother would see their mom. They'd held on to the calls and letters that happened for the most of their life so far. So that was the one thing that remained consistent, and yet those stopped also. The kids were understandably incredibly broken-hearted, and they would believe for a long time that they'd been fully abandoned. But the truth was worse, and she was close by all that time, only about 8 miles or 13 kilometers away from where she was visiting her children. Her skull has never been found, but the rest of her remains actually sat in that garbage bag at the rear of the property in the middle of town for 20 years. and they at least now know that she didn't leave of her own accord. That's the thing about these stories. So many of them have children, and while it's bad enough to lose a mom or a dad in that way, it's likely worse to believe they walked away on purpose. And while it doesn't specifically say so, I imagine the fact that Rebecca's mom disappeared the day before her birthday and didn't show up for her actual birthday event is probably a crushing blow every year. So the truth of the matter is, crimes like this, they affect everybody all around them, and so often the kids end up paying the price. It doesn't appear she was reported missing, and that was perhaps why they weren't able to match it up. But as I've mentioned in other videos, it's normal for family members not to report in this situation, because how do you know they're missing if their default is being missing? If it's normal for them to disappear. And then, of course, at this time, it was normal for the police not to take the reports anyway on someone in a situation like this. But the sad thing is the kids just didn't know. Her son would go on finally to say that knowing what happened to his mom brought a little bit of light to him. He would explain that Katherine's life started out as a struggle, which might have led to the kind of parent that she was. Born in 1957, her own mom had passed away when she was really young, leaving her with a father who decided he didn't want to care for her or her siblings. So as a result, he walked away and all of the kids ended up in foster care. She eventually met her husband, Van Johnson, when she was just 16, and he was 18, and she wanted a family so badly that she decided to get married and start one right then and there. And they would go on to have 2 children. And at first, it seemed like Katherine's desire for stability and a real family of her own had paid off. But then she started to experiment with illegal substances, and this was something her husband wasn't into at all. They would begin drifting apart, and eventually her husband would have to step away a little bit in order to try to keep the kids safe. He took them and he moved into his mother's house. However, he loved Katherine and he was sad, but he was doing what he had to do for his kids. And at this point, of course, all he could do was try to provide some sort of stability on his part. Sadly, along this time, Katherine herself became less and less stable. He would later say that her lifestyle changed and she liked that camp life or whatever it was that they were doing. Her ex-husband would say that he got a phone call at one point where a man called and told him that he had bought a Cadillac and was planning on driving Katherine to California. Katherine's ex-husband would say that he tried to beg her to stop her from leaving, to stay for both him and the kids, but she refused and she did leave in 1977. But over the time, she wrote a lot of letters and she especially tried to stay close to her daughter, which is likely why she came back right before her birthday. And whatever happened, happened. Katherine's youngest child, Tony, is now 48, and his last memory of his mother was of her running up and down the street playing with him. Van Johnson, her ex-husband, eventually remarried. The police tried to tie Katherine to the property where she was found, but they haven't been able to do that so far. So right now, it's really important that anyone with information come forward. Katherine Parker Johnson was missing for 42 years, and an unidentified Jane Doe for 21. Had she lived, she would be 68 years old today. The St. Tammany Parish John Doe, 1993, identified as Joseph Muniz. This story begins on October 29, 1993, when squirrel hunters were out in what was described as a swampy woodland area located along railroad tracks near Interstate 59 in the Pearl River Wildlife Management Area, which is in Louisiana. It was here that a man was found in the Pearl River Wildlife Management Area, and this is 2 miles away from the Mississippi state line. The area itself was heavily wooded. Scavengers had really messed up the scene, and they only located a skull and some of the skeleton. They did find what they described as a unique pair of eyeglasses, as well as some articles of clothing. They would estimate the man was about 5'6" to 5'8", or 168 to 173 centimeters tall, and likely around 25 to 38 years of age. They were unable to estimate even his hair color, so they would send his remains off to the LSU Faces Lab in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and this was meant for further testing and, of course, a recreation of what he might have looked like. The recreations that were done on this case can be seen here. There were actually multiple done from 1993 to 2003, but no one came forward with information to identify him. There was significant trauma noted to his right hip area, and it was likely this happened shortly before he passed, believing that the break may have led to a limp and possible back pain. The authorities hoped this would help with identification. They would state that his COD was caused by an item that, for YouTube, I will just say, begins with a G and rhymes with run, and this happened to the rear area of his head. While he was found in October of 1993, they aren't quite sure when he passed, but they didn't believe it was longer than 6 months earlier, which was April of 1993. As they searched for who the John Doe was, the case would stall, and they would eventually request assistance of the coroner's forensic DNA lab. And they ran those results through CODIS, which, as I've mentioned before, is the cheaper option of processing DNA, looking for matches. They also uploaded the case to NamUs, and they began searching to families who submitted DNA of missing loved ones. Unfortunately, this didn't work, and they would end up having to opt for a more expensive sample in order to use genetic genealogy. In April of 2023, they would receive a grant from the Season of Justice in order to pay for processing through Othram Labs. But then, of course, began the complicated process of getting DNA that was suitable for processing. It was a difficult process, but it paid off, and the DNA led to 2 possible siblings of the man in question, with both living in Burnsville, Minnesota. These possible siblings would donate their DNA, and it was a match. His siblings would confirm to the police that Joseph Lee Muniz was born in January of 1972. Joseph was just 21 when his life was taken. His family had believed he was somewhere in Louisiana when he disappeared in 1993, which means he was a 17-hour drive from home, around 1,190 miles, or 1,920 kilometers. If more comes out on this case, I will insert it here now as an editor's note. The only other information I've found so far is they identified a possible suspect as the perpetrator. However, unfortunately, that person has already passed away. Joseph Lee Muniz went unidentified for 30 years. Had he lived, he would be 51 years old today. The Pleasant View Jane Doe, identified as Michelle Inman. This case is one of many known as the redhead M-word. There were quite a few unsolved cases where redheaded females in the United States between October 1978 and 1992 were believed to have been linked to someone traveling around taking lives. While some appear to be outliers, many did appear to be linked. Rather than run down the previous cases, you can find a link to that video in the description below. The young woman in this specific case was found in Pleasant View, Tennessee, near the side of the highway, Interstate 24, on March 31, 1985. She was believed to have passed between the months of October 1984 and January 1985. In this case, they submitted DNA in hopes of finding her name, but it was determined that the skeletal remains were just too degraded to even get a workable DNA profile. But then entered Othram Labs, who was able to get that profile, and they were able to use it for genetic genealogy. This officially led to relatives in Virginia and leading to a man who was shared his sister had disappeared 4 decades earlier. Further testing of that man would prove he was, in fact, the brother of the woman they were trying to identify. Michelle Inman was just 24 when her life was taken. She was born in Nashville on April 17, 1961. At this point, they just really need someone to come forward to offer more information. They're not sure what Michelle's movements even were at that time. Michelle Inman went unidentified for 38 years. Had she lived, she'd be 61 years old today. Pipeline Pete, identified as Jack Clawson. Oil was booming in the late 1970s and early 1980s in Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota. This story itself begins on August 28, 1982, in Granger, Wyoming. It was here that a pipeline crew was out surveying a remote area. They would find a man, and upon examination, it was determined he'd passed due to exposure. They believed he was likely 25 to 35 and 5'5" to 5'7", or 165 to 170 centimeters. Because of his location when he was found, he was given the nickname Pipeline Pete. For those not familiar with his time in the area, the oil boom was pretty crazy. I was actually in grade school in this same area. We had moved from Montana to North Dakota, and my sister and I would just count oil wells all along the highway to occupy us. But there were oil wells visible from the highway all over the place. And where they were drilling, area hotels and motels were of course swamped with workers who were sometimes transient, going from site to site. It was pretty easy to pick up work, and many would come and go. So whether he was there for that reason or not, it's not known for sure, although it seems likely he wasn't. But likely the police at that time suspected that was what it was, and that the man could be from anywhere. And of course it would turn out he wasn't from that actual area. It would take genetic genealogy to finally identify Pipeline Pete as Jack Clawson. Jack had actually disappeared from Fremont, California, the year before he was found, in 1981. There was no known reason for him to be in that area at all, so nobody had any idea to look for him there. He was 24 and was actually from Missouri, and he had traveled from Missouri to Fremont, California, to visit relatives, and it was on this trip home that he would disappear. His family believed the plan was to return back to Missouri in order to go on a hunting trip with some friends. Those friends were expecting him, but he never showed up. So traveling from California back to Missouri, this is actually about 1,150 miles, or around 1,850 kilometers. If he was traveling with anyone, it's not been released. What always seems strange to me is that many of these times people were riding in a car, so where was it? And if he was alone, he likely did have a car with him. The police are needing more pieces of the puzzle in order to identify what happened. If anyone knows anything about this case, the contact number's on the screen right now. His family was actively looking for him the whole time. So the big mystery is why he was in Wyoming in the first place. Jack Clawson was missing for 42 years and was an unidentified John Doe for 40. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 64 years old today. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. The whole dance with YouTube is hard sometimes. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.